The Gortharn warriors loomed over the humans like granite monoliths, their laughter echoing off the jagged cliffs of Arvanes. "You call that running?" Sergeant Rallick bellowed, his voice a low rumble that carried both scorn and amusement. "I've seen hatchlings move faster than this." Corporal Mia Cade gritted her teeth, her boots digging into the rocky dirt as she forced herself up the incline. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she refused to falter. Behind her, a few other members of the human task force struggled to keep pace, their breath ragged in the thin mountain air. "Keep going," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. "Don't give them the satisfaction." Above them, the towering forms of the Gortharn moved with effortless grace, their powerful legs devouring the rugged terrain as if it were a mere stroll. They were a race bred for war, their muscular frames and dense bone structures granting them a natural advantage in environments like this. "This is embarrassing," Commander Gordhack sneered, standing with his arms crossed at the summit of the hill. His crimson eyes gleamed with derision as he watched the humans struggle. "You expect us to call these creatures allies? They'd snap like dry twigs in a real battle." Rallick, standing beside him, chuckled and gestured at the humans with a clawed hand. "It's not their fault, Commander. Their world is soft, their bodies weaker than wet bark. They were never meant to survive out here." Cade reached the summit just as Rallick finished his sentence. She staggered to a halt, hands on her knees, drawing in sharp gulps of air. Her squadmates followed moments later, collapsing in exhaustion. "Done already?" Rallick's lip curled in mock pity as he leaned toward her. "Maybe we should fetch you a stretcher." Cade straightened, wiping the sweat from her brow. She met Rallick's gaze, her blue eyes blazing with defiance. "Thanks for the concern, Sergeant, but I'll pass." Rallick blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her audacity. Then he laughed, a deep, booming sound that rattled Cade's nerves. "I'll give you credit, little human. You've got fire. Too bad it won't help you here." "Fire burns longer than you think," Cade shot back, stepping closer. A low murmur passed through the Gortharn warriors gathered nearby. Gordhack's gaze flicked to Cade, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Bold words," he said. "Let's see how far they carry you." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The rumble started as a faint vibration, then grew into a deafening roar. The cliff face behind them cracked and shifted as chunks of rock began to tumble. "Earthquake," someone shouted. Panic erupted as humans and Gortharn alike scrambled for cover. The once solid ground turned treacherous, and the air filled with choking dust. Cade dove to the side as a boulder the size of a transport pod crashed where she'd been standing moments before. "Regroup." Gordhack's commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Get to stable ground." Cade coughed, blinking through the haze, her heart pounding. She spotted one of her squadmates, Private Elson, pinned beneath a fallen tree. She rushed toward him, but before she could reach him, a massive figure appeared. Rallick. The Gortharn soldier lifted the tree effortlessly, tossing it aside as if it weighed nothing. He glanced at Cade, his usual smirk replaced by something unreadable. "Move," he growled. "This isn't over." Together, they pulled Elson to safety, but the tremors hadn't stopped. A deafening crack signaled the collapse of part of the cliffside. As the dust began to settle, it became clear they were stranded, cut off from their extraction point by miles of hostile terrain. Cade locked eyes with Rallick. For the first time, there was no mockery in his gaze, only grim realization. Their survival would depend on more than strength. It would depend on working together. But that was easier said than done. The landscape had transformed into a nightmare. Jagged fissures split the ground where the earthquake had torn through, and massive boulders now littered the terrain like the discarded remains of some ancient battle. Dust hung in the air, a choking reminder of the chaos that had separated them from their extraction point. Corporal Mia Cade adjusted the strap on her pack and glanced around at the group. 10 humans, 15 Gortharn warriors, most of them battered but alive. It was a fragile alliance at best. "Situation report," Commander Gordhack barked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. Sergeant Rallick, leaning heavily against a boulder, grimaced as he gestured toward his mangled leg. A jagged shard of rock had torn through his armor during the quake, leaving him limping and pale from blood loss. "I'm not moving far like this," he admitted, his tone laced with frustration. Gordhack's crimson eyes flicked to Rallick's injury, his expression hardening. "Then you'll stay behind." The Gorthorn murmured in agreement, their culture valuing strength above all else. Cade felt a hot surge of anger rising in her chest. "You can't be serious," she said, stepping forward. Gordhack turned to her, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Survival comes first, human. The weak will slow us down. That's how it's always been." "Then maybe it's time you reconsidered how it's always been," Cade snapped. "Leaving him here is a death sentence." Rallick gave a low growl, his pride bristling at her words. "I don't need your pity, human." "It's not pity," Cade shot back. "It's basic decency. Something you might want to look into." The Gorthorn warriors shifted uncomfortably, some casting uncertain glances at one another. Gordhack, however, remained unmoved. "Enough," he said. "We move now. Those who can't keep up." "I'll carry him," Cade interrupted. The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. Gordhack's eyes narrowed, and several of the Gorthorn barked out incredulous laughter. "You?" Gordhack sneered. "You'd collapse under his weight before we made it a mile." Cade met his gaze, her jaw set. "I've carried heavier things than his ego. Just watch me." Rallick opened his mouth to protest, but the look on Cade's face silenced him. Without waiting for approval, she knelt down beside him, looping one of his massive arms over her shoulders. "You're insane," Rallick muttered as she helped him to his feet. "Probably," Cade replied, gritting her teeth as she adjusted to the weight. The Gorthorn soldier was easily twice her size, his dense musculature making him feel like a boulder. Her legs trembled with the effort, but she straightened, refusing to falter. The Gorthorn watched in stunned silence as she began to walk, each step slow and deliberate. The humans, inspired by her defiance, quickly rallied to support her. "Let's move," one of her squadmates, Sergeant Vega, called out. The group set off, the humans taking point while the Gorthorn lingered at the rear, their usual arrogance dampened by the sight of Cade's determination. The terrain grew more treacherous with every passing mile. They climbed steep inclines, crossed narrow ledges, and waded through icy streams. Cade's muscles screamed in protest, her vision blurring from exhaustion, but she pressed on. Rallick, uncharacteristically silent, watched her with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You're going to kill yourself doing this." Cade didn't slow down. "Better than leaving you behind." "Why?" he asked after a long pause. "Why would you risk so much for someone like me?" Cade adjusted her grip, her voice steady despite the strain. "Because it's not about strength, Rallick. It's about loyalty. Something you'd understand if you didn't spend so much time looking down on everyone else." The Gorthorn warrior fell silent, her words striking deeper than he cared to admit. By nightfall, the group found shelter in a shallow cave. Cade collapsed to the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion. Rallick, now propped against the cave wall, watched her with an unreadable expression. As the humans lit a small fire, the Gorthorn gathered in hushed conversation, their usual bravado tempered by what they had witnessed. Even Commander Gordhack seemed thoughtful, his gaze lingering on Cade as she rested. For the first time, the Gorthorn began to question their definition of strength, and the human who carried one of their own might just hold the answer. The next day began with cold, damp air and a sense of unease that hung over the group like a storm cloud. The cave had offered a brief reprieve, but as the first light of dawn crept over the jagged peaks, it became clear just how far they still had to go. The extraction point was over 30 miles away, separated by uneven terrain and an unforgiving environment. Corporal Mia Cade tightened the straps on her pack and adjusted Rallick's weight over her shoulders. Every muscle in her body protested, screaming for rest she couldn't afford. But she refused to stop. "Let me walk," Rallick growled for the third time that morning, his tone carrying more irritation than gratitude. You'd make it 20 steps, and we both know it, Cade replied without looking at him. Rallick's pride bristled, but he said nothing more. Instead, he scanned their surroundings with sharp, crimson eyes, his natural instincts attuned to danger in ways Cade couldn't fully understand. The group moved in a tense silence. Humans took point, scanning the terrain for hazards, while the Gortharn lagged behind, their usual arrogance replaced by an uneasy quiet. Even Commander Gordhack, who had spent the previous day mocking Cade's efforts, seemed lost in thought. As they ascended a steep incline, Cade's legs trembled under Rallick's weight. Each step felt like an eternity, and her breath came in short, labored gasps. A sharp rock tore through her boot, sending a jolt of pain up her leg, but she bit down on her lip and kept going. "You're going to kill yourself," Rallick muttered again, his tone softer this time. "Then maybe you'll carry me the rest of the way," Cade shot back, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. To her surprise, Rallick chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that almost sounded like approval. The trail narrowed, forcing the group to navigate a precarious ledge that clung to the side of a sheer cliff. Below, the rocky ground disappeared into a misty abyss. "Watch your step," Sergeant Vega called from the front, his voice tense. Cade focused on her footing, every step a battle against gravity. Behind her, she could hear the Gortharn murmuring among themselves, their voices tinged with something she hadn't heard from them before, uncertainty. Halfway across the ledge, the unthinkable happened. A distant roar echoed through the mountains, followed by the unmistakable sound of falling rocks. "Rockslide," someone shouted. The ledge trembled violently as a cascade of boulders thundered down the slope, sending shards of stone flying in all directions. Cade stumbled, her boots slipping on the unstable ground. "I've got you." Rallick's arm tightened around her shoulders, his powerful grip steadying her. The two of them pressed against the cliffside as the rockslide roared past, narrowly avoiding being swept away. By the time the dust settled, the ledge had grown even narrower, and the group was split, humans on one side, Gortharn on the other. Gordhack snarled in frustration, his deep voice carrying across the gap. "We'll find another way down." Cade glanced at Rallick, who was still leaning on her for support. "Looks like it's just us for now." Rallick nodded, his usual arrogance tempered by something almost resembling respect. "Then let's make it count." Together, they pressed forward, two unlikely allies navigating a hostile wilderness, their survival now dependent on a bond neither of them had expected to form. The jagged peaks of Arvanis rose like broken teeth against the sky, their cold, unyielding faces a reflection of the ordeal ahead. Mia, Cade, and Rallick moved slowly, the path narrowing to treacherous ridges that crumbled underfoot. The Gortharn's weight on her shoulders felt heavier with every step, but she didn't falter. "You've proven your point," Rallick said, breaking the silence. His voice, usually laced with sarcasm, now carried a strange edge of vulnerability. "You're not weak. You can stop now." Cade adjusted her grip on him, ignoring the ache in her back. "It's not about proving a point," she replied, her breath coming in labored gasps. "It's about doing what's right. Big difference." Rallick was quiet for a moment, his crimson eyes scanning the horizon. "Where does that stubbornness come from? Is it just you, or are all humans like this?" "It's not stubbornness," Cade said with a faint smirk. "It's grit. Humans don't quit. Not when it matters." Rallick's silence spoke louder than words. As the sun rose higher, the terrain grew even more unforgiving. Cade stumbled on loose gravel, her knees buckling under the strain. Rallick reached out, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "You're going to get yourself killed," he muttered. "Maybe," Cade said, her lips twisting into a wry smile. "But you're still here, aren't you?" For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of understanding that transcended their differences. By mid-afternoon, they reached a plateau where the path widened slightly, offering a brief respite. Cade lowered Rallick onto a flat rock and collapsed beside him, her chest heaving. The silence was broken by the faint sound of movement behind them. At first, it was barely noticeable, but then it grew louder, a low growl, guttural and menacing. Rallick stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. "We're not alone." Emerging from the shadows of a nearby crevice was a creature unlike anything Cade had ever seen. Its sleek, reptilian body moved with lethal precision, its scaled hide glistening like polished obsidian. Razor-sharp claws scraped against the stone, and its golden eyes fixed on them with predatory hunger. "A Krynith," Rallick whispered. "Arvani's apex predator. It hunts anything that moves." Cade pulled her rifle from its sling, her hands trembling slightly. "You could have mentioned that earlier." The Krynith lunged without warning, a blur of muscle and claws. Cade fired a burst of rounds, but the creature twisted mid-air, evading the shots with eerie agility. It landed mere feet away, its snarling maw revealing rows of serrated teeth. Rallick pushed himself up, his injury forgotten in the face of the imminent threat. "We need to move." Cade stood her ground, her rifle aimed squarely at the creature. "You can't outrun it," she said through gritted teeth. The Krynith lunged again, and this time, Cade fired with precision. The round struck true, hitting its side, but it only enraged the beast. It reared back, readying another attack. Without thinking, Rallick grabbed a nearby shard of rock and hurled it with all his strength. The makeshift projectile struck the creature's head, sending it stumbling backward. "Now!" Rallick barked. Cade didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet as they bolted toward the far edge of the plateau. The Krynith, dazed but unrelenting, gave chase. "Keep going!" Cade shouted, her heart pounding as the beast closed the distance. Rallick stumbled, his injured leg giving out, but Cade caught him before he fell. With a burst of adrenaline, she dragged him toward a narrow crevice in the rocks. "Get in," she yelled, shoving him through the gap. The Krynith lunged one final time, its claws raking the air as Cade dove into the crevice. The beast slammed against the rock wall, its growls of frustration reverberating through the narrow space. For several tense moments, they waited, breathless, as the predator prowled outside. Finally, it retreated, its growls fading into the distance. Cade slumped against the wall, her entire body trembling. That was too close. Rallick, still catching his breath, glanced at her. For the first time, there was no sarcasm, no mockery in his gaze, only respect. "You're insane," he said, his voice low. "But you saved my life." Cade managed a weak smile. "You would have done the same." Rallick didn't respond, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't so sure. The storm swept in without warning. Heavy winds howled through the mountain pass, carrying sheets of icy rain that soaked Mia, Cade, and Rallick to the bone. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the once firm trail turned into a slick, treacherous path. Cade pulled her hood tighter, her hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Each step felt heavier than the last, her muscles burning from the constant strain of carrying Rallick. Despite his insistence that she leave him behind, she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. "We can't keep going like this," Rallick growled over the roar of the wind. His voice, though weakened, carried an edge of urgency. "The storm will kill us before anything else does." "Not an option," Cade replied, her breath visible in the frigid air. "We're too close to stop now." Rallick scanned the horizon, or what little of it he could see. The faint glow of the extraction beacon pulsed in the distance, barely visible through the storm. "Close isn't good enough if we don't make it in one piece." Cade glanced at him, her lips tightening. She knew he was right. They needed shelter, and fast. Ahead, the path opened into a narrow valley, flanked by steep rock walls. Cade spotted a small overhang on the left, a potential refuge from the elements. "There," she shouted, adjusting her grip on Rallick and trudging toward it. The overhang provided minimal protection, but it was enough to shield them from the worst of the storm. Cade lowered Rallick onto the ground and slumped against the wall, her chest heaving. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the relentless howl of the wind outside. Finally, Rallick broke the silence. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Cade frowned, not understanding. "Why what? Why do you keep pushing yourself like this?" His crimson eyes bore into hers, searching for an answer. "You could have left me behind a dozen times. You still can. But you don't. Why?" Cade looked away, the weight of his question pressing down on her. She thought of her squad, her training, and the values drilled into her since her first day as a soldier. But more than that, she thought of her humanity. Because that's what we do, she said finally. We don't leave people behind. It's not about strength or weakness, it's about being better than the worst this universe can throw at us. Rallick's gaze didn't waver. And what if the cost is your life? Then at least I'll die knowing I didn't quit when it mattered, Cade replied without hesitation. For a long moment, Rallick said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. You're a fool, he said, though his tone lacked the usual bite. But maybe that's what makes you different. Cade allowed herself a small smile, but it quickly faded as the storm intensified. The overhang groaned under the weight of the wind, and loose rocks tumbled from the cliffs above. We can't stay here, she said, her voice firm. If this place collapses, we're done for. With Rallick's help, she fashioned a makeshift crutch from a broken piece of debris, allowing him to walk with minimal support. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Together, they stepped back into the storm, their sights set on the faint glow of the extraction beacon. Every step was a battle, the icy wind cutting into their skin like knives, but they pressed on. As they neared the final stretch, a deep, rumbling growl stopped them in their tracks. From the shadows emerged a second Krenith, its golden eyes gleaming with predatory intent. Rallick straightened, gripping the crude crutch like a weapon. It's your turn to carry me, he muttered, baring his sharp teeth in a defiant grin. Cade smirked, raising her rifle. Not a chance. The Krenith lunged, and together, Human and Gorthorn stood their ground, ready to face the storm and the beast head-on. The Krenith charged with terrifying speed, its obsidian scales glinting in the dim glow of the extraction beacon. Rain and wind lashed against the figures of Mia, Cade, and Rallick as they braced themselves for the inevitable clash. Don't hesitate, Rallick growled, gripping his makeshift crutch as if it were a battle axe. It won't. Good advice, Cade muttered, leveling her rifle. The beast lunged, its claws slicing through the air. Cade fired a burst of shots, each round finding its mark in the Krenith's flank. The creature roared in pain, but it didn't slow. Rallick stepped forward, swinging his crutch with brutal force. The impact landed squarely on the creature's head, staggering it just long enough for Cade to reposition. Move, she shouted, grabbing Rallick and pulling him back as the Krenith recovered. The storm intensified around them, lightning illuminating the battlefield in brief, violent flashes. The ground beneath their feet turned to slippery mud, making every step a gamble. The Krenith circled, its predatory eyes gleaming with feral intelligence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Cade's mind raced. They couldn't outrun it, not in this storm, not in their current condition. Their only chance was to outthink it, to use the environment to their advantage. There, she pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face nearby. If we can funnel it through there, it won't have room to maneuver. Rallick nodded, his sharp instincts taking over. Draw it in. I'll be ready. Cade sprinted toward the crevice, firing a few shots to keep the beast's attention. The Krenith roared and charged after her, its massive body barely fitting through the narrow gap. As it lunged, Rallick sprang from the side, using the last of his strength to drive his crutch into the beast's injured flank. The Krenith howled in agony, thrashing wildly as it collapsed in the confined space. Now! Rallick shouted. Cade didn't hesitate. She took aim and fired a single, precise shot into the creature's eye. The Krenith let out a final, ear-splitting shriek before its body went limp, collapsing into the mud. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm and their ragged breathing. Cade leaned against the rock wall, her hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Not bad, Rallick said, his voice hoarse but laced with approval. Not bad yourself, Cade replied with a faint smile. The storm began to break as they neared the extraction beacon, the rain easing into a steady drizzle. When the pulsating light came into full view, it felt like salvation. Cade activated the beacon's signal, her chest tightening with relief as the faint hum of a dropship's engines reached her ears. Moments later, the craft descended, its searchlights cutting through the gloom. The rear hatch opened, and medics rushed to assist. Rallick waved them off, insisting he could walk with Cade's help. Together, they boarded the dropship, collapsing onto the cold metal floor as the hatch sealed behind them. Hours later, back at the base, Cade stood on the observation deck overlooking the mountains. Her body ached, every muscle screaming for rest, but her mind refused to settle. Footsteps approached from behind. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You should be resting," Rallick said, his voice softer than usual. "So should you," Cade replied, glancing at him. His leg was wrapped in a thick bandage, but he stood tall, his usual commanding presence tempered by something new, humility. Rallick stepped beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You saved my life," he said after a long pause. "Twice." Cade smirked. "Lost count, actually." Rallick chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. "You proved something out there. Not just to me, but to all of us." "And what's that?" "That strength isn't just in the body. It's in the will." He turned to face her, his crimson eyes serious. "I mocked humans for being weak. I was wrong." Cade crossed her arms, steadying him. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Rallick smiled faintly. "Don't let it go to your head, human." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared ordeal settling between them. "Gordhack's been talking," Rallick said finally. "Says this will change how we work with your kind. More respect. More trust." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Even from him?" "Especially from him," Rallick admitted. As the sun broke through the clouds, casting its golden light over the mountains, Cade felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had survived. But more than that, they had changed something fundamental, bridging a gap between two species with nothing more than grit, determination, and the refusal to give up. For the first time, Rallick extended his hand. "You're an ally worth having, Mia Cade." She took it without hesitation. "Same to you, Rallick. Even if you're stubborn as hell." The Gortharn warrior laughed, and for the first time, it wasn't mocking. It was the sound of respect earned.